Hello. Thanks for tuning in to this discussion on the integration of faith and learning, specifically what we mean by it, what it looks like in our current environment, and why it's so important, not just for our campus communities, but also for society more broadly. I'm Morgan Fettis-Satry, the managing editor of CCCU's biannual magazine Advance, where we'll be including a transcript of this discussion, and I'll be the moderator for our conversation today. Not only have I been working at the CCCU for nearly a decade now, but I'm also a CCCU graduate twice over from Whitworth University in Spokane and Fuller Seminary in California. So this topic is particularly near and dear to me. So I am so grateful to be joined today by a fantastic group of scholars and practitioners who serve at several CCCU institutions across the U.S., and they come from all sorts of academic and professional backgrounds. It's really a small glimpse of the full spectrum of what we do in Christian liberal arts education. So let me introduce them briefly, and then we're going to dive right into our questions. First, we have Dr. Esau McCaulley. He's Associate Professor of New Testament at Wheaton College in Illinois. He's the author of a number of books, including the forthcoming How Far to the Promised Land? One Black Family's Story of Hope and Survival in the American South, which will be released in September. He's a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, and he has also written for publications like The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Christianity Today. Next, we have Dr. Todd. He serves at Indiana Wesleyan University as a professor of humanities in the John Wesley Honors College, as the executive director of faculty research and scholarship, and as senior fellow for programming for the Lumen Research Institute. In addition to the many books he has authored or edited, he's also the CCCU's senior fellow for public engagement, and he serves as the publisher for Christian Scholars Review. Then we have Dr. Derek Schuurman. He's a professor of computer science at Calvin University in Michigan. He worked in the industry for several years before returning to academia, and he's particularly interested in the various issues related to faith and technology. He's the author of Shaping a Digital World, co-author of A Christian Field Guide to Technology for Engineers and Designers, a book review editor for Perspectives on Christian Science and Christian Faith, and a regular contributor to the Christian Scholars Reviews blog. And then we have Dr. Andrea Scott. She's an academic leader with extensive experience in the business world. She currently serves as provost at George Fox University in Oregon. Her previous academic leadership experience includes serving as dean and a professor of marketing, and she's also a former Fulbright scholar. Her business experience includes advertising agency experience with national clients such as General Mills and Wrigley, and with NBC during the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I want to start basically by establishing a groundwork. I feel, at least at the CCCU offices, we throw around the phrase the integration of faith and learning, or faith integrated learning, however you want to describe it. And not everyone always knows exactly what we mean, or maybe we mean slightly different things when we say it. So I want to start by asking how each of you would describe what it looks like in your classroom or on your campus, or if you want to put it a slightly different way, how would you kind of summarize it when you're talking with students or their parents when they ask you, what do you mean by the integration of faith and learning? Dr. McCaulley, let's start with you.
It's a little bit tricky for me because I actually teach Bible. And so the integration of faith and learning takes on a little bit of a different vibe. I know when I talk to my colleagues in math and science and other places, and they're struggling, like, should I do a devotional, or should I try to tie some theological concept to what we're studying? And for me, my content is all biblical studies. And so what I'm doing is I'm actually trying to show that learning is actually related to faith. And everyone else is asking, how does faith come into learning? As a Bible scholar, I try to teach my students that biblical studies is an academic discipline. And to understand that there are certain questions and that we're not in simply an extended devotional when we're doing Bible and theology classes is part of my work. But the other thing that I try to say to them in particular is that biblical studies, and maybe this is all of us wants to think our disciplines are special, but in the same time that we're studying the material is also studying us. And so I talk to them, they're both engaging in an academic discipline that is asking you at every page the existential questions. Who am I? What does it mean to be human? What is the good life? All of these questions come up in biblical studies, and that's part of what it means to do faith and learning on my side. So I'm helping them understand that there's academic questions related to biblical studies. But the other thing that I'm also trying to do is show how these biblical studies questions come into their lives. How does what God says about money and family and community relate to the kinds of careers we choose? And so, and like I said, in biblical studies, we're often trying to take all of that theological content and put it into their lives and help them understand that they're doing real academic work.
I might just add that I chafe a little bit at the phrase integration of faith and learning. And part of that is because I think that there's always hidden assumptions and presuppositions in every single discipline, in every single classroom. And so this idea that you have to take some religious content and somehow bolt it on to your course, I think is an artificial notion. I think that even in, secular settings where people have this sort of idea that it's completely neutral, I think they're wrong. Like Esau said, there's ideas about what does it mean to be human? What's wrong with the world? What's the remedy? These things are always floating below the surface, often implicit. In fact, looking back to my undergraduate education in a large secular school, it's only now that I'm able to look back and none of these sort of questions were answered explicitly, but it was implicit throughout the curriculum. There was a certain idea about what flourishing was and how to achieve that. And in engineering, there was this technological worldview that the world is a machine that can be manipulated and optimized. And so integrating faith and learning isn't something that you artificially have to do. It's always there. The neat thing about a Christian college is that we can be very explicit about the biblical story animating every single thing in our discipline, including, I might say, computer science and engineering topics where people think, oh, isn't that just cold, hard math? Well, no, technology is not neutral, and faith has a lot to say about how we use these tools. So that's some of my thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, that feels especially relevant given all the conversations about AI and Chat GPT and stuff we've been having in recent news.
Oh yeah, it's not neutral. Definitely not.
Yeah, I often encountered a similar frustration in the discipline of business, because of course God is nowhere in business. Like, really? How that is not how my Bible reads. So for me, when I thought about this question, I really actually went back to the Westminster Catechism, really, as I understand it, where it's about man's chief end is to glorify God and worship him forever. And that, to me, permeates the worldview, the perspective that I take to anything that I'm preparing for my students, reading. I love what you said, Esau, about the discipline teaching you, or I forget the phrase you use.
We are under examination. The material
under examination. Absolutely. And in the what permeates my thinking is the end purpose, my end purpose, to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And that colors how I view anything that I read, that I digest. That's the way that I've tried to frame it for myself, and whenever possible for students.
As a parent of one college student and a second who will start this fall, I'll take this question actually from the perspective of how to communicate with parents. It's something I've always enjoyed doing, but it's something now I have a more empathetic point of connection to. I sort of hear myself when I listen to administrators talking in these sorts of capacities more, and wonder how I'm coming across. And we live in an age where parents are reconnecting in a number of ways. Some of the literature says that reconnection is helpful to young people. Some of it says it's not so helpful, but I think it's a transitory age in which we live, where parents are trying to find their footing in relation to their children, their children's lives, being invested in them, hopefully in the best possible ways, but also when adolescence is being extended longer than it had been before. And so, what I enjoy when I talk with parents is that the integration of faith and learning is about the fact that I live first and foremost with the responsibility of trying to understand God's story in the largest possible sense. I'm not going to be able to do that in full, likely this side of eternity. But that is my first commitment to you all as parents. And in order to do that well, I have to take the responsibility of getting to know your son or daughter as a whole person. And no offense to my friends who teach at state universities, but students are not simply minds in a classroom or potential citizens. Those are characteristics of students that come into the classroom. And I do have friends at state universities who care about them more in those ways. But we, by virtue of how we see students, see them as whole people. And then the discipline, and this is where the integration component comes in, is the discipline is that we live in that sort of mediating tension with our discipline as a way of trying to bridge the gap between where the student is and how the student understands him or herself at any given point in time, and living in that largest possible story. So sometimes a couple of my colleagues will occasionally say that, your discipline, first and foremost, it's not an end, it's a means. It's a means to shape certain virtues. It's a means to address certain vices, but it's a means. And we do hope in a number of those disciplines they go on to flourish professionally as a result of what we teach them. But if those characteristics are not there, then we're not going to be able to help students live in the largest possible story. And in the end, that's our first commitment.
That's good. Yeah, thank you all for sharing those really, really thoughtful insights. Todd, you had mentioned a phrase, that transitory period, I think you said. This has been nothing if not a transitory period these last couple of years. Andrea, I think you started in your role at George Fox at 2020, which just saying the words 2020 kind of gives everyone like heebie-jeebies.
I started in the fall of 2019.
Oh.
So the second semester of my first year was when everything shut down.
Not much better for you then.
Yeah, I do not recommend starting a new job in a new city, at a new school,
Oh my gosh,
in the middle of a pandemic.
I agree.
Yeah.
Well, now that I've sufficiently raised a bit of trauma for everyone, I want to talk a little bit about some of this disruption and the changes that we've been seeing. And some of these trends have been going on for a long time, and the pandemic has just kind of accelerated them. But I want to spend a few minutes first talking about the changes in our incoming student population, and specifically, actually, not so much demographic changes. We talk about those a lot, which they're important, but there's a growing awareness, and we actually have another piece in advance that will be kind of touching on this as well. But I really want to dig into it here too, about the kind of the familiarity, or really the lack thereof, of basic tenets of Christian doctrine and theology. As American culture kind of continues to secularize, and you have the growth of nuns, quote unquote, there's just this really kind of this shift in what we can anticipate our students generally having an awareness of now when it comes to Christian ideas of Christian theology, biblical, even just Bible stories in general that we kind of take for granted that they might know about. So I want to pose the question, and Dr. Rearm, I'll start with you. Should faculty and administrators be rethinking the approach to the integration of faith and learning in light of all these transitions that we've had? And if so, how do you see, what are some of the ways you think that we should be rethinking them?
Yeah, I think it's always good to be returning to this question. I think we have to refresh it each year, if for no other reason than we have a new class of newly minted terminal degree colleagues coming into the institution. And so professional development is the second critical phase in the process of bringing somebody into the institution and welcoming them into your community. The first is how we communicate when we post or we recruit. The second is the ongoing, and hopefully that process is a lifelong process for all faculty, but it's certainly critical. So for younger colleagues, so it's always a question we need to be coming in with. I think what we need to be asking ourselves, so thinking about that logic of the nature of the story, and the expansive nature of God's story. I think this recent period in time, this has, and it was coming before the pandemic. I think the pandemic just really accelerated this sort of dimension of our existence right now, is that we've become very fearful people, and we're fearful people in part because our understanding of the gospel has become cramped and self-referential and defensive. And I think that's what we need to check right now, and we need to be looking at is when we speak with one another. We got a faculty meeting tomorrow at Indiana Wesleyan. What will be the nature of our dialogue when we're sharing with one another? Will it reflect those qualities of a gospel that's cramped and self-referential and defensive, or will it reflect qualities of hope and the redemptive power of God's grace in all that we are called to do and all who are called to be? I think those are the things that we need to be asking ourselves. I'm fortunate to work with colleagues who I think are really prayerfully, straining into what a hopeful posture is. But our students are acutely aware of that, and so if we are selling them nothing more than what to be afraid of and who's to blame for it, then we've got bigger problems than we even think we do right now culturally. We have the opportunity, and I think it's a blessed opportunity in a number of ways to be stewards of a hopeful story and an expansive story with our students.
Can I say that my hope would be that if we would understand that we're coming into a less biblically literate age, that CCCU schools will be places where there's more robust biblical and theological education. And I worry sometimes that market forces are causing us to maybe sell everything except for the part that makes us unique, which is the Christian heritage. And so I really would wish that we would make space in the curriculum to make sure we have give people the opportunity to be really formed and shaped, and that we would also invest in real development for our faculty, because they're coming into these same things with the same kind of lack of potential opportunity for formation, that we would invest in that. There is a long, like all ideas have consequences, but if you go back up to graduate education a decade or two ago, so I think on this soapbox, sorry, warning, graduate theological education a couple of decades ago began to remove Greek and Hebrew and reduce the requirements and shrink the MDivs because market forces drove them to that, which means you had a less well-formed pastorate, which then filters all the way down into churches, which filters all the way down to our students. And so each time we make a market compromise for the sake of holding a share, there's ideas always have consequences. And if we're going to say that we value these things, it needs to be reflected in how we train our faculty and how we train our students. And the second thing that I will say is that if we're going to be a Christian institution, maybe we should market in central, like make central the Jesus bits. And sometimes I worry that in place of a clear convictions about the person and work of Jesus, we are tempted to convince our prospective parents that we will give a certain ideological formation instead of a spiritual formation. And so I would pray and hope that we would say, we want your students to be more deeply in love with God and his word and the historic teachings of the church, even though we might be diffuse in some of our political leanings. But I worry that in place of, you can go here and get a good dose of scripture and theology and church history and spiritual formation and ethics, we're saying, come here and you will get complete ideological conformity. And that's just simply not what the church is. And so I would hope, this will sound overly superficial, that Christian schools would stay Christian.
I concur. As I really appreciated both of those responses, and what keeps coming at me, and maybe even be part of what we talk about a little later in this conversation, is the role of discipleship. And I think we have walked away from that a bit. And Jesus calls us to make disciples. And I think so often we think about that primarily as evangelism. And I think it's bigger than that. I'm not the theologian in the group, but I know that God has called us into discipleship, and that is part of the burden. You talk about spiritual formation. I think about how we need to have fewer assumptions about what people know, before we start questioning what they believe. And so there is a call for discipleship that is both exciting and a little surprising, the extent to which we need to walk along colleagues and students. And that, to me, puts a burden on leadership to be discipled by the Lord Jesus daily in order to be in a position to pour out.
Yeah, and I would echo all of those things as well. And just to add that the fact that there's a declining sort of theological fluency in our students is also an opportunity. I think there's an opportunity to kind of just knock their socks off with this sort of comprehensive Christian worldview, in terms of, there's this phrase that I love from Gordon Spikeman, a former theology prof here, who said once, there's nothing matters but the kingdom, but because of the kingdom, everything matters, right? This cosmic scope of redemption. It's really exciting, right? If they come in thinking, well, Christian education means attending chapel and not drinking in the dorms or whatever, that's a very narrow kind of, not very exciting view of what faith is. But if right from the beginning you can knock their socks off with this cosmic sort of view of the gospel's implications for all of life, that can be really, I've seen students light up. It's like, here's a way to think about my whole life, it's a real neat opportunity. And then I would echo too, the need for faculty mentoring and training. I mean, realistically, all of our faculty, perhaps with the exception of theology faculty, are in secular higher education, getting their PhDs. They're basically catechized for 7 years in the sort of worldview thinking of their particular discipline, and they get their PhD by sort of being able to articulate the sort of paradigm of their discipline in an acceptable way. And then you bring them into your Christian college, and they really need to be challenged and equipped to sort of question the sort of hidden assumptions in their discipline, right? The sort of philosophical presuppositions that they've been trained in and mentored in for 6 or 7 years, and sift them through this sort of comprehensive Christian worldview. And faculty, really are at the heart of that mission of this comprehensive view. And in order for them to articulate that to students, we need to spend a lot of effort and resources on equipping our faculty. So yeah.
That's exactly what I thought when Esau said that he hoped that the Christian college would stay Christian. We live in an era where, financial margins need to be watched, quite carefully in any number of ways. And as a result, things that tend to be perceived as proactive are being cut on a number of campuses. And faculty development, faculty formation tends to be one of those things that's perceived as proactive. And so we're seeing declining investment in that. At the exact same time, we need to be I don't know that there was ever a golden age of faculty development on campuses, but we need to be increasing it in its quality and its quantity. And again, it needs to be lifelong in terms of one's commitment to the academic vocation. I think we've done an adequate job of maybe a first-year course for faculty or something like that on a number of campuses. But how do we keep resourcing faculty in such a way that they can be models to their junior colleagues, but also stay passionate and engaged over the course of their lifespan? And so one of the things that has been growing in concern for me is how we're cutting these things at the exact same time we need to be increasing them.
Yes.
I want to kind of stay on this topic of like engagement. When we think about all of the pandemic transitions, obviously one of the biggest ones is that sudden, sometimes traumatic transition to online learning or online exclusive in a lot of cases, and then back to social. And when I think of like my own academic career, so I did my entire seminary degree online. So like for me, I was like, oh, everyone's just kind of catching up. But like when I sit down and really think like what would have been like as an undergraduate level, right, to kind of sit and all of a sudden like have all this disruption and chaos and unknown and figuring out tech. So I think about that a lot, but this conversation is also making me realize like I have not done enough thinking about how that has impacted our faculty. And it sounds like maybe from what you were saying, Todd, maybe we all have not done enough of that thinking and prepping. And so, Dr. Schuurman, I'm going to tweak my question a little bit to you with this kind of idea of that transition from online back to in person, and now we're kind of seeing growing trends of like a hybrid model. How, as we think about what faith integrated learning looks like in this kind of shifting environment, how can we kind of keep that faith integrated aspect when we start having such physical distance from each other? Because to me, like that in present part is what made my undergraduate experience so meaningful. So how do we kind of keep that? Basically, how do we, Mr. Computer Science man, how do we keep the humanity in our technology?
Yeah, a residential Christian liberal arts undergraduate experience is a many splendored thing. And I think, actually, I use this example with my students. So I teach a capstone course in faith and computing, and we look at digital life, and we look at all kinds of contemporary issues and technology through a Reformed Christian lens. And one of the things I talk about is the importance of physicality, right? As we build all of these tools, we actually lose something, and they're beautiful. I mean, this very meeting where different parts of the country were able to do it through Teams, and there's lots of blessings that come with technology in terms of making connections. But the question about what does it mean to be human that sort of came up earlier, right, also has to do with our physicality, about the incarnation being an excellent example of the importance of sort of physically being present. And so I have students sort of reflect on some of the things that came up during the pandemic, and they really realize that there's sort of a reduction in terms of our ability to live in community and to be able to communicate and so on. So I think it's been helpful for students to reflect about the limits of sort of digital learning. On the flip side, a lot of distance education, a lot of online education actually allows Christian higher education to be made accessible and obtainable to people who might otherwise not be able to, move to a Christian college and live in the dorms for 4 years. And so I think we need a somewhat balanced approach, but always understanding the importance of sort of physical community. Also, when it comes to church, I talk to my students about, online worship services, right? And even now in computer science, a lot of people are talking about VR, right, and Meta, and working in the virtual world. Can we actually have the Lord's Supper in a virtual world? Is this, or is that a kind of heretical sort of idea, and sort of thinking about the importance of our physical self? So it's a philosophically fascinating and rich conversation, especially for people who are creating sort of these digital spaces that we're going to be living in, but giving them a sensitivity to the importance of sort of nudging people into physical community, and that includes in higher education, I would say. So those are just some general thoughts that come to mind with that question.
I get excited about the options that the digital space has provided for learning styles. I think that was probably one of the most exciting things coming out of I love the word you said, manic rush to get online, is that we learned that there were people who could experience and understand our what they were learning in very different ways. They participated in class differently. They challenge other students to enter into a new way of learning. And when I thought about this question, I was recently hearing a pastor talk about how we're so uniquely wired with different ways to worship God. And it was very exciting. Some people need nature, music, physical activity, conversation, the list goes on and on. And in my experience, it has been truly exciting to watch how the online space has created a new, almost a new language for people to enter into the learning space. And I call my church Digi Church, and how Digi Church and the bonds formed there has strengthened my own faith. I think that can that experience of a different way of processing, engaging, etc., can deepen faith, deepen experience, deepen connection to the institution. What Dr. Rearm was talking about, the fear-driven, I think we need to really back away from the fear and figure out how we can embrace more and more. Or, you know, I don't know, I just feel like as believers, we have such advantage with the Holy Spirit. We got to leverage it every way we can. So anyway.
I think it's a little bit tricky. I graduated from undergrad in 2002, and I'm in my early 40s. 43, I can claim it as early still. And I think that
claim it as long as you can.
I think everyone, I still grew up in a time before online education was normative. And most of us who have this dream of being liberal arts educators is because we have this visceral memory of like the joy of learning in class and the influence professors had upon us. You want to serve our students in that way. So there's a sense in which I want to go along with Derek, say yes, in-person education is really, really important. And I still believe that. And at Wheaton, we still, are mostly an in-person institution. But I'll also say that I think that most studies show that the moment that you get flexible delivery systems, it increases the opportunity in diversity. So ethnic diversity and gender diversity, you get more women, at least in graduate school, more women and more ethnic minorities who are able to access theological education. And it tends to be people with resources who have the money to move and relocate and be in place for 3 or 4 years. And one of the advantages that secular institutions have, and this is some things I say to CCU schools all of the time, is they have more scholarship money often if you're ethnic minorities, and they have ease of access. So we can't be inaccessible and more expensive. And so I think that we need to find ways to make in-person education affordable, and we need to be able to have compelling scholarships for our students so we can bring them in to experience what we have in the CCCU. But I also want to say we have to understand that there is a justice issue as it relates to access, and that if we want to be a place that educates everybody, we can't be so much purist that we're not allowed to say, I will sacrifice a little bit of the dream that I had in my head as to what a professor might be, so that I might be that kind of professor for more different types of students in different places.
No, I would agree wholeheartedly with that. I think one of the things I would add here too is that as a teacher, this is my 27th year, so not only were my student days, but my first 15 years or so of teaching and administrative work were, the only way we were going to do it necessarily was in person. I drove 100 miles each way actually for graduate classes at one time for my doctoral work, even because that's how we did it. And I think it's an opportunity though for us as educators, as teachers, to think about what anthropology we're bringing with us and anthropological assumptions we're bringing about students. Because the danger is we can flatten students' identities greatly and back to sort of an information dissemination sort of mode if we simply see them as spaces on a screen. So the question becomes, do we recognize the assumptions with which we're working, or we may be sliding to, and then what other means does technology or in-person interaction or whatever is available to us in the moment with a particular student or group of students, do we avail ourselves of those resources, take advantage of them, of extending? I still think there's certain blessings to in-person education. If for no other reason, yesterday I walked out of a faculty seminar meeting, and there was a student coming up the walkway who I had meant to have a prolonged conversation with about some perceived interest on my part that I thought she had. And I just hadn't had a chance yet to sort of catch her and ask her, and then, see how we can resource her better should my impressions of those interests be correct. So, there's ways to do those sorts of things otherwise. And and sort of extend those serendipitous sort of moments. But we got to take the time to ask ourselves, how deep is and how large is the anthropology with which we're working when we're interacting with students in certain spaces and in certain ways. Oftentimes, I mean, the downside perhaps of in-person education is, we could go that way too, but at least when we had the disruption of doing it from in-person, for those of us who did, to online that abruptly, those questions hopefully came, and they stick with us too.
Man, this is so good. I want to be respectful of time, so I'm going to actually jump to our last question for you, Dr. Scott. And this is going to obviously be one for everyone, but you guys obviously all have decided to work at faith integrated institutions. And so I am very curious to hear, why do you think that it's so valuable, and what gets you out of bed to go do this work in the morning? What do you see it offering students, to communities more broadly, for the church? However you want to take that question, what do you see it offering that gets you excited about this work?
Oh, okay.
Small question.
Well, I have a natural love for Christian higher education. I believe in it deeply. I think it was cemented in my heart during my MBA experience, where I was completely ostracized, rejected, just considered quasi-lunatic for believing what I believed about the Lord Jesus in my business school. And it was in that moment that I realized that, in my estimation, grad school is one of the last windows we have to bring truth to people who are in a place of reception. They are curious, they're asking questions. And I think we can't sleep on grad school, that there's an opportunity there. And the same thing persists in undergrad, but at a different level. This is a space where we have an invitation from the target audience. Tell us what you think. We want to know. It's an incredible opportunity and privilege to bring Christ to disciplines, to hearts, to minds, even folks that have, quote unquote, grown up in church and have never really understood their world, their place in the world. I love that, what you were saying, Dirk, about the a cosmic understanding of the kingdom and where you fit, and this opportunity you have to be a part of what God is already doing in the world. So I believe that because as Christians, and I mentioned a little earlier, we have the power of the Holy Spirit, that is extra discernment, that is extra power, we serve the God of the universe, and his omnipotence is something we do not leverage enough. And it's frustrating when I see the fear, when I see the worry, and I'm like, we are working for the eternal God, and nothing is too hard for him. Our schools need to look and feel and operate differently. And I think if we were to really, really lay hold of that faith integration that we talk about, I think we would look differently. I think our students will come out differently. I think they'll show up in the world differently. Our churches could look differently. So I just don't want us to sleep on the privilege that we have, the burden that we have, the opportunity that we have for discipleship, for training, for equipping. And, faculty, the identity of what a faculty is, it's going to keep changing as we wrestle with mental challenges of our students and our colleagues, as we still are in a cloak of anxiety post-pandemic. All these things need to be seen more as opportunity, and we need to come at them not from a place of fear, but I believe from a place of power, because God is that awesome, and he's invited us to be a part of what he's doing. And I just want to partner with him as closely as we can, because I think when we can demonstrate the power of unity and God's power, big things can happen. So yeah, I think it's valuable because we have God on the inside, and that makes a huge difference in what we can do and what our students look like.
I want to say, I think that the question is like why I stay. And I think we need to be honest and say that, and this is not across the CCCU, but there are places where there's been a significant exodus of faculty of color and women and female faculty of color, in particular, single female faculty. And so we need to ask the question, why are there so many people who don't stay at CCCU schools and why they're struggling? And we have to ask ourselves, what's been going on in the last 5 to 10 years that has led to significant losses in those categories? And who feels more emboldened in CCCU institutions and who feels afraid is a question every administrator has to ask. Because these things have consequences. I think we were going through a period of increased diversity, increased concern for issues of accessibility, and now with a certain fearfulness and suspiciousness, and I think that has permeated this divisive era in the church, it's affecting our schools and it's affecting our education. And so I would say my hope is that more schools are willing to make the sacrifices to make it possible for more different types of people to be at their institutions. And I think that whenever people hear that, they tend to think that there is some kind of hidden theological agenda underneath that statement. And I'm actually talking about the combination between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And that right belief and right behavior are what it means to be a flourishing institution. And the ethnic minorities who are leaving and the women who are leaving and the single women who find it hard is not because of the values. The values actually are what bring us there. It's the hidden rules and the added things, kind of the added elements of the law, right? These kinds of things have run people out. And so rather than answering the question of what I need, why I stay, I want to pose the question to anyone who might read and encounter it. What can you do to make it possible for everyone to flourish at your institution who shares your values? Maybe this is a long way of getting around why I stay at CCCU schools when a lot of us don't have to. I genuinely believe that people who believe the same things ought to be able to live together in community across ethnic difference. And it is, to me, heartbreaking that so many ethnic minorities have to leave Christian spaces in order to feel like they can be themselves. And so I stay in CCCU schools in the hopes that these schools might become a place where we can bring the entirety of who we are in service to God and the people He has given to us to serve.
That's a word.
Yeah, I guess my story, what brings me into it and sort of why I stay is, and here's the time for true confession. As an undergrad, I did not attend a CCCU school.
Me either.
I was at a large secular technology school in Canada, and I was working as an electrical engineer in industry for a number of years, as you mentioned in the intro. And I distinctly remember sitting in a cubicle farm and wondering, now, how in the world does my work as an engineer connect with my faith, which is this comprehensive part of my life? How do I connect the dots between these things? Now, if I'd gone to a good CCCU school, I would have known the answer to that question. And to be honest with you, the way that I learned how to answer that question is I became a Christian college professor. Now, I felt a call and a tug towards teaching. It was something that was laid on my heart, and I managed to make the shift and go to a CCCU school. But it was through the faculty mentoring. In fact, I would have attended the CCCU school for free, if just for the education. I would never have told an administrator that, but I was hungry to kind of learn about how to connect the dots. And so what I see is sitting in my classroom is young engineers and computer scientists who are going to be in those cubicle farms and in those other places. Maybe some of them will be Daniels in Babylon as well, going off into industry and Silicon Valley. But kind of helping to equip them so that, they don't have to sit and wonder. and then to be agents of change, and people who are helping to shape the digital world, right, and help to be salt and light in all those various places. So I'm hoping to help equip them so that they don't have to take the long road like I did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you asked the question, what gets us up in the morning or, excites us, more again, and it sort of relates to what Derek was just describing. I mean, my answer has sort of two pieces, but one of them sort of emotionally resonates with me at a much sort of deeper level. And maybe this is the parent again, sort of coming in here, because I'm hoping that the same thing is being afforded my own daughters in their own contexts where they're getting an education. But the thing that I get most excited about, is when I walk into a classroom and can focus myself, in such a way, because I think that's also part of the key, is how do I sort of prayerfully engage myself and engage with the class that I'm about to walk into, in a way that I'm reminded that I am stewarding in various forms God's created potential there in the lives of these people. They've entrusted themselves to me. Their parents have entrusted themselves to me. Their pastors have entrusted themselves to me, and their God has entrusted themselves to me. And do I, by virtue of the interaction that I have with them, help them to believe something bigger about themselves than what they believe at that given moment, regardless of what the discipline is, the technological dimensions of what we're talking about, et cetera, that they need to master, is do they in the end believe something larger about themselves as someone who's created in God's image? And that's what gets me up in the morning, is because you can see it when the light goes sort of on in a young person that yes, there's something more to my life than just sort of survival, that I have a contribution I can make in some way. And I think, the second, as I've gotten older, is I become more aware of the fiduciary responsibility I have as a scholar to hope, go back to Esau's line about, will the Christian college stay Christian and continue to advance a message that is distinctively Christian. That can never be taken for granted. And so intellectually, sort of what gets me up in the morning is thinking about whether or not the intellectual architecture of our institutions is sufficient to do that. And we then ordering and offering opportunities for our faculty to step into an architecture that allows them to live that out. I read a wonderful book by a Congregation of Holy Cross priests by the name of Father Leo Ward called Blueprint for a Catholic University. It was published in 1949. So Catholics were still on sort of the cultural margins, intellectual margins, very much discriminated against in a lot of parts of the country. But Father Ward had this understanding that initially didn't ring with me as being significant, but has since haunted me, that said that the Christian university, the Catholic university, is adequate. Everything else, that pretends to be a university is inadequate because nothing holds it together. And do we cultivate spaces that are adequate? However, the word adequate, I don't think any of us would say we want to lead adequate lives. But when we talk about the university, an entity that has a center that holds, that is what makes it adequate. And that's what allows the flourishing that our students can be afforded to happen. And so I think that's the other piece, is thinking about whether or not what I am sooner now than later going to pass on to students. I mean, I'm over halfway through my career now, so that has sort of come more in mind. And what kind of opportunities will we pass along through the scholarship that we do about that architecture? Because it's not guaranteed necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Man, you're on mute, Andrea.
Yeah, I'd like to add, as I listen to the gentleman, and to get back to the question about what makes it valuable. for me, it's the opportunity to be unapologetically countercultural. So many of the disciplines, the assumption is that Christians can't bring valuable thought, that our thinking is already off. So I'm always challenging faculty to be excellent in their space. I would love to see CCUs be excellent in their space, not just with the intellectual contribution, not just with producing world transformers, as we like to see, but I would love to see us look different, getting back to Esau's comment. And Derek, you talked about this cosmic understanding of the kingdom. We know what the kingdom looks like. Our campuses do not look this way. And I think we're missing an opportunity to really bring that value. What would it look like to be places where all boats rise, where there's flourishing for all, and we are so intentional about it. We bring our intellectual horsepower, and we bring the power of the living God to this. It would be countercultural. It could be powerful in ways that we have yet to fully understand. But
making the Christian university. Yeah, sorry, just to riff off of that, making the Christian university a plausibility structure, showing a glimpse of what this might look like, right?
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
That's better than adequate. Yeah, but yeah, carries the same sort of sentiment in that regard. And I think this is where our theological imaginations just haven't been large enough in terms of how we can deliver that. And so how do we cultivate that amongst ourselves? Be bold enough to be able to then develop it, and charitable enough to share it well with our students and our neighbors, at other universities, whether they be faith-based or not.
I'm just waiting. Maybe I'm going to get off my soapbox, but I'm going to climb upon it, and I will climb
Get
down.
on that soapbox.
I'm just waiting for us to be truly guided by what the scriptures say, rather than saying it would be nice if we get these things that were biblical after we do these other things. And what I mean by this is there's not a way of reading the New Testament or the Old Testament or any part of the Christian tradition where it doesn't have a vision for the different ethnic groups of the world worshiping the one true God. That's just, it's not an optional extra. It's not something that you do after you do other things. It's right there. It's at the Great Commission, right? And so if at the center of the Christian story is the power of the gospel to bring people together, and we can accomplish that goal, that is not a small failure. If the doors are open, but we can't embody the kingdom, then what have we actually accomplished? And I think that we're still in a place where we hope that once we paid all of our bills, it will be nice to be diverse. So we hope that after we've done these things, we will be concerned about the gender balance in our faculty. But maybe these things, if they're from the Lord, ought to be integral to our mission. And when we begin to analyze whether or not we're succeeding, it's not the enrollment, it's not just the donations, it is how are we embodying God's vision for the future when the kingdom comes in its fullness in the present. And like when you talk about the plausibility structures, the students that are seeing such a complicated and often distorted picture of what Christianity is, what if they would say, where I saw the kingdom of God was at my Christian school. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the vision that keeps me in this space. But I just wonder sometimes how widely this vision is shared, not as an optional extra, but as a theological mandate.
Yeah, we talk a lot about.
It's out of me. I'm not gonna say it again.
We talk about the integration of faith and learning, but there's also the integration of faith and administration in Christian higher education. How do we actually, as leaders, sort of set a vision for this and then provide intentional resources to make it happen? Yeah,
it requires a lot of courage. It requires a lot of. That's
and
not where we've seen a lot of consistent performance. Yeah.
Well, and it's like you said earlier, Esau, like those decisions that you make today, they might not be visible now, but in 10 years, 20 years, couple generations, for good or ill, we're going to see. And that makes it hard for being in the middle of this work, because sometimes that fruit is very far off. But it also can be kind of scary when you think about the small changes that make today and how they can lead to tomorrow. So I feel like I have kept you guys much longer than I initially promised. So I do need to wrap us up, but man, we need to have a part 2 of some of these conversations, especially that point about the administration. I think that actually is something we're probably going to dive into a little bit more in the fall. So stay posted. But thank you once again to each of you for spending some time here talking with me, lending your counsel, your leadership, your experience. I know that I'm really looking forward to seeing how our readers and viewers can kind of really run with this. And thank you to anyone who is listening to this. I know it's after the fact, but I hope it's been as enlightening and helpful for you as it has been for me. I hope it starts some really important conversations on your campus. That's the goal here, and that we can be the ones that start kind of scattering those small stones, making those small decisions that really, really do make that kingdom difference for the future generations to come.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
It's good.
Thanks.
Thank
It's
you
been
very much.
delightful.
Thank you. Have a
Appreciate it.
wonderful day, everyone.
We
You
will.
as well.
Thank you.
All right.